Lauren arrived in Tucson wearing the same practiced expression she had used for years when she thought charm could fix what greed had broken, but the woman who opened the courtyard gate was no longer the mother she had tried to warehouse away. I stood beneath the desert sun outside my casita, silver hair pulled back, deed folder in one hand, the trust documents in the other, and for the first time in decades my daughter looked uncertain. She began with tears, then excuses, then outrage when she realized apology would buy her nothing. She said she only wanted what was best for me. I slid the papers across the wrought iron table and let her read in silence. My home in Arizona was owned outright in a living trust beyond her reach. The old family house she had pushed me to surrender had already been sold months earlier, not to fund her schemes, but by my own instruction, with proceeds moved into charitable annuities and a scholarship fund in my late husband's name. The inheritance she had counted on had vanished the day she tried to reduce me to a room number in assisted living. Her face changed when she reached the final page. My attorney had filed a formal elder financial coercion complaint using the messages, recordings, and property paperwork she never knew I preserved. Her attempt to pressure me into signing over control had triggered an investigation that cost Greg his brokerage license after he was found advising her in conflict of interest on assets that were never theirs. The social circle she cared so much about had already heard why I left. Her church friends knew. Her country club knew. Even the women who chaired her charity luncheon knew the daughter, who preached compassion, had tried to exile her own mother for convenience. She whispered, "You ruined me." I looked at her and said, "No, Lauren. You mistook access for ownership. You ruined yourself." She asked what was left for her. I told her the same thing every adult has left when entitlement dies: consequences. Then I handed her one final envelope. Inside was a notarized amendment removing her as medical proxy, financial agent, and executor forever, replaced by people who had shown me loyalty without expecting reward. I watched her hands shake. For years she had spoken to me as though age made me powerless. Yet here she sat, realizing the woman she tried to discard had outplanned her at every turn. When she asked if I would ever come back home, I smiled and looked toward the mountains glowing red in the late afternoon. "I am home," I said. She left before sunset, carrying nothing but papers proving everything she tried to control was gone. Weeks later, I learned she sold her oversized house to cover legal fees and stepped down from 2 boards after the scandal spread. People called it a fall from grace. I called it arithmetic. As for me, I kept my mornings on the patio, coffee in hand, desert birds in the mesquite, and peace no one could repossess. At 72, I had not been sent away. I had chosen freedom. My daughter once told me to move into assisted living. Instead, I moved to Arizona without telling her, protected my name, redirected my legacy, and taught her a lesson she could never inherit. They say revenge is loud. Mine arrived by certified mail, trust law, and a one-way ticket west. And in the end, I did not just keep control of my life. I became the author of its final chapter. Move into assisted living before something happens to you, my daughter said over pot roast at my own kitchen table, as if she were recommending a better brand coffee. I remember the way her fork rested untouched on the china, the way she avoided my eyes when she said it, as though rehearsed concern might soften a betrayal. The room went still. Even the grandfather clock in the hallway seemed louder. I was 72 years old, not confused, not bedridden, not asking anyone to rescue me. Yet there sat Lauren, my only daughter, explaining that a facility outside Phoenix had walking paths, card nights, and transportation, as if my life had already narrowed to bingo and pill organizers. I folded my napkin and placed it beside my plate. I did not argue. I had learned long ago that the most dangerous moments in a family are often wrapped in polite voices. Greg, my son-in-law, cleared his throat and added that maintaining my house was becoming impractical. Impractical. That word sat in the air heavier than insult. This was the same colonial home in suburban Denver where I raised Lauren, where pencil marks still hid inside the pantry door showing her height at age 6, 8, 10. The same home my husband Walter and I paid off after 30 years and 2 recessions. And suddenly, at one Sunday dinner, It was spoken of as a burden to be managed. Lauren slid a glossy brochure across the table. Desert Ridge Senior Living. Smiling silver-haired couples under cottonwood trees. A heated pool. You'd make friends, she said softly. I touched the brochure but did not open it. Something colder than hurt moved through me. It was recognition. I had seen that look before in estate offices after Walter died. The careful look people wear when they have already made plans involving what belongs to you. It's only a suggestion, she said, too quickly. But no loving suggestion arrives with brochures already circled in red ink. I looked out the kitchen window toward my hydrangeas swaying in late spring wind and thought of Walter's voice from years ago, low and amused, saying, "Never let anyone decide where you grow old." At that moment I said nothing because silence can listen better than anger. Lauren mistook my stillness for surrender. She smiled with relief. Greg changed the subject to mortgage rates. But I was no longer hearing dinner conversation. I was hearing something underneath it. A door closing. That night, after they left, I sat alone at the table long after the dishes cooled. The brochure remained where Lauren had placed it. Moonlight from the sink window touched its glossy cover. I opened it at last and saw one sentence highlighted by someone else's pen. Peace of mind for families making difficult decisions. Families. Decisions. My name was nowhere in that sentence. I should have thrown it away. Instead, I slipped the brochure into a drawer beside Walter's old letters. Because by then a thought had already begun forming, small and dangerous. If my daughter believed she could relocate my life for my own good, perhaps she had forgotten something essential about the woman who raised her. I went to bed that night not frightened, but awake in a new way. And the next morning, before Lauren called to check in, I made a phone call of my own to a realtor in Tucson, Arizona. The realtor in Tucson was named Maggie Collins, and her voice carried the kind of calm confidence I had not realized I missed. She spoke slowly, as if there was no emergency, which somehow made my pulse settle. She described a small adobe-style casita on the edge of a 55-plus community near the Catalina foothills, 2 bedrooms, a shaded courtyard, citrus trees in the back. She said the morning light there made the mountains turn rose gold. I wrote the address on the back of an old grocery receipt and stared at it for a long while. Tucson, Arizona. Nearly 800 miles from Denver. Far enough that no one could drop in unannounced with brochures and decisions already made. I did not tell Maggie much, only that I was considering a change. But she seemed to hear what I did not say. Sometimes, she told me, people move here to begin again. Begin again. The phrase stayed with me. That afternoon Lauren called, overly cheerful, asking whether I had looked through the assisted living material. I told her I had. There was a pause, almost disappointed that I was not upset. "We just worry about you," she said. But worry has a texture, and this was not it. Real concern warms. This felt managerial. After we hung up, I opened a cedar chest in my bedroom and took out Walter's old leather document folder. Insurance policies, property records, trust papers. I had not touched them in over a year. Dust clung to the corners. As I sorted through them, I found a handwritten note folded between tax returns in Walter's blocky script. "If you ever feel pressured, slow everything down. Never sign anything in fear." I sat on the edge of the bed and laughed softly through tears because, even dead, that man was still giving instructions. Over the next week I noticed things I might once have excused. Lauren asked whether I had updated my will. Greg offered to help review my monthly expenses. A brochure from a different senior facility arrived in the mail addressed to me, though I had never requested it. Coincidence is a word people use when they do not want to study patterns. I began studying. One Tuesday, Lauren invited me to lunch at a cafe near her office. During salad, she casually mentioned that large houses were difficult to sell in winter, almost as if thinking aloud. I smiled and changed the subject to the weather. But something in me had sharpened. That evening I called Maggie again. She walked me through market values in Tucson, homeowners association fees, property taxes. Numbers steadied me. Facts are a kind of shelter. Then she said the casita might not stay available long. I looked around my Denver kitchen, copper pans over the stove, Walter's coffee mug still on the shelf, snow beginning outside the window, and felt two loyalties pulling at once. One was memory. The other was survival. That night, I did something I had not done since Walter died. I booked a flight. One-way fares to Tucson in early June were cheaper on Tuesdays. $298. I clicked confirm before I could talk myself out of courage. When the email arrived, I printed it and tucked it inside the same drawer where Lauren's brochure lay hidden. One paper promised supervised decline. The other whispered escape. And as I turned off the kitchen light, I began to wonder whether my daughter had made one fatal mistake. She had assumed age had made me easier to move. 3 days before my flight, Lauren came by unannounced carrying lemon muffins from the bakery I used to love when she was a girl. She kissed my cheek, too brightly, and set the box on the counter as though we were simply having an ordinary mother-daughter visit. But ordinary visits do not begin with people scanning your living room. I saw her eyes pause on the framed watercolor Walter painted in retirement, on the mahogany secretary desk, on the silver tea set from my wedding. Inventory has a look. I recognized it. She made coffee while talking about harmless things, traffic, a neighbor's remodel, a friend moving her father into memory care. Then she asked, almost lazily, whether I had ever considered simplifying before a crisis. Forced decisions. Forced decisions. Again, that language of inevitability. I stir my coffee and asked what crisis she imagined. She laughed and said I was taking it too seriously, but her smile never reached her eyes. Before leaving, she slipped a manila folder onto the table. Just information, she said. After she drove away, I opened it. Inside were floor plans for assisted living units, cost comparisons, and, tucked in the back, a property valuation printout for my Denver home. Not a general neighborhood report. My address. Estimated market value highlighted. I sat, so still I could hear the refrigerator hum. There it was. The thing beneath the politeness finally showing its outline. They were not planning for my care. They were planning around my assets. I did not cry. I called my attorney. Harold Levin had handled Walter's trust for years and answered on the second ring. I asked a few questions in a voice, so even he grew quiet. Could anyone pressure changes to title without my consent? No. Could I amend powers of attorney? Immediately. Could someone's attempts to induce relocation for financial convenience create exposure? Potentially. Harold did not dramatize. He never had. But by the time I hung up, the ground beneath me felt steadier. The next morning I met him downtown in an office smelling faintly of old paper and coffee. We reviewed everything. I updated directives, removed contingencies, strengthened the trust. At one point, Harold looked over his glasses and asked, "Evelyn, are you preparing for a dispute?" I answered, "I am preparing for independence." He nodded as though he understood more than I said. On the drive home, I took a longer route through streets Walter and I once walked after dinner. Brick bungalows, rose hedges, children on bicycles. I realized grief had kept me living as caretaker of a museum. But life was asking movement. That night Lauren called again. She said she and Greg had found a wonderful place with a waiting list and might need a deposit soon to hold a unit. Might need. Soon. Deposit. Every word a test. I told her not to make plans on my behalf. Silence met me, hard and surprised. Then she said something I would not forget. "Mother, at some point I may have to step in. Not help. Step in." As though authority were naturally transferring. After he ended the call, I took the hidden flight confirmation from the drawer and placed it beside the property valuation she had left. 2 futures lay on the table. One arranged for me, one chosen by me. I knew then I would leave before anyone could move another piece on this board. But what I did not yet know was that the next morning a call from the county recorder's office would reveal something far more dangerous than brochures. The call came at 9:12 in the morning while I was watering the hydrangeas. A woman from the county recorder's office asked whether I had recently authorized an inquiry regarding a possible transfer preparation tied to my property parcel. At first I thought she had the wrong person. Then she read my address. My grip tightened on the hose. She explained no transfer had been recorded, but a preliminary title information request had been initiated through a brokerage channel associated with Greg's firm. Preliminary. Informational. Innocent-sounding words. Yet I knew enough by then to understand what they suggested. Someone had begun looking at my house as transaction, not home. After we hung up, I stood in wet grass feeling not fear, but a terrible clarity. The brochures, the valuation report, the talk of deposits, Greg's sudden concern about my expenses. Separate threads no longer looked separate. They formed a rope. I drove straight to Harold's office without calling first. He closed the door when he saw my face. I told him everything. He listened with fingertips pressed together, then said something so calm it chilled me more than alarm would have. Evelyn, you may be dealing less with caregiving pressure and more with asset positioning. Asset positioning. Even the phrase sounded bloodless. He suggested we place a temporary alert on title activity and document every communication. He also recommended something unexpected. Say nothing. Let them believe you remain undecided. Sometimes protection begins by not announcing you see the trap. On the drive home, I remembered a summer long before any of this, Lauren at 12 years old sitting cross-legged on the porch, asking why her father locked important papers in the fire safe. Walter had smiled and said because trust is precious, and precious things deserve structure. I had thought of marriage when he said it. Now I understood, he had also meant law. That night I opened the fire safe and found one more document I had overlooked, a letter Walter wrote to me the year he survived bypass surgery. If ever someone mistakes your kindness for weakness, surprise them. I laughed aloud in an empty room. That man still knew how to enter a moment. 2 days later I flew to Tucson for what I told Lauren was a church retreat. She barely listened. She was busy explaining that she had spoken to a woman at the senior community, and there was 1 unit left. 1 unit left. Urgency again. In Arizona, Maggie met me under a hard blue sky bright enough to make Colorado feel dim by memory. She drove me past saguaros and terracotta roofs to the casita. Small stucco walls. Green shutters. Lemon tree in the courtyard. A fountain whispering in shade. I touched the kitchen counter and felt something I had not felt in years. Possibility. Maggie talked numbers. I asked practical questions. Then I made an offer before I could let caution dress itself up as duty. By sunset, we were drinking iced tea on the patio, while quail crossed the gravel path. Do your children know? Maggie asked gently. I looked toward the mountains and said, not yet. On the flight home, I kept the purchase agreement folded inside Walter's old document folder. One secret replacing another. But when I opened my front door near midnight, I saw an envelope slipped under it in Lauren's handwriting. Inside was a typed checklist titled Transition Planning for Mom. At the bottom was a date for a facility tour already scheduled in my name. The typed checklist lay on my kitchen table like a verdict someone else had written for my life. Facility tour, medication review, downsizing consultation. My name appeared at the top beside a date and time I had never agreed to. What startled me most was not the presumption. It was the confidence. Lauren had moved from suggesting to arranging. Somewhere in her mind my consent had become a detail. I sat down and read the pages twice. At the bottom she had signed love. Just trying to help. I folded the papers carefully and placed them beside Walter's letter. Help can be the gentlest disguise ambition ever wears. The next morning Lauren called asking whether Thursday still worked for the tour. Her tone implied an ordinary appointment, as though we had discussed it over tea. I told her I had plans. Mother, she said, irritation slipping through, this is becoming urgent. Urgent for whom, I wondered. I apologized and said I had a legal appointment. That silenced her. She disliked the word legal. When we hung up, I called Harold, then Maggie. By noon, the Tucson purchase moved into escrow. Harold arranged overnight signatures through secure courier. Every form I signed felt less like escape and more like reclamation. Yet I knew leaving required more than buying another house. It required exiting before Lauren realized the board had changed. I began quietly sorting possessions. Not the grand silver or antiques she likely assumed mattered most, but what made a life. Walter's Navy photograph. My recipe card stained with cinnamon. A quilt my mother hand-stitched in 1958. I shipped 3 boxes to Arizona under Maggie's address. To Lauren, they would have looked like ordinary donations leaving the house. To me, they were breadcrumbs toward another life. Then came the moment that stripped away any last innocence. Greg stopped by one afternoon claiming he was nearby. He stood in the den pretending to admire Walter's old globe, then casually asked whether I had considered putting Lauren's name on the house for probate simplicity. So casual, so polished. I smiled and asked whether he offered that advice as son-in-law or broker. His ears reddened. He laughed too quickly and changed subjects. But after he left, I wrote down every word. Harold had told me documentation turns intuition into evidence. That evening, Lauren arrived unexpectedly with takeout and a softness in her face I almost believed until she said the senior community had held the unit, but needed a deposit by Friday. Greg, confront it, she added. Front it. There it was. A transaction already advancing. I looked at my daughter and saw not the child who once slept with a flashlight under blankets, but a woman frightened she might lose access to something she had counted on. I asked, if I say no, what then? She stared at her hands before answering. Then I may have to make hard decisions. The sentence chilled me more than any threat, because hard decisions, spoken by family, often means power claimed through concern. After she left, I walked room to room, touching walls Walter painted, banister worn smooth by decades, the pantry door with Lauren's height marks. Grief rose sharp and sudden. Leaving was no longer abstract. It was betrayal answered by departure. Near midnight, Maggie called. The seller had accepted. Closing could happen remotely within days. I stepped onto the porch under cold Colorado stars and understood the window had opened. If I hesitated, Lauren would tighten control. If I moved now, she would wake one morning to a silence she did not design. I slept only a few hours. At dawn, I began making a list of what fit in 2 suitcases. But before the week ended, a bank manager I had known for years would call me into his office and show me something that made even my preparations feel dangerously late. Martin Reyes had managed my accounts for nearly 20 years and was not a man given to drama, which is why his voice on the phone unsettled me before he said a word of substance. Evelyn, I think you should come in, he said. Today, if you can. At the bank, he closed his office door and slid a printed authorization inquiry across his desk. It was not a completed transaction, but a request someone had made about adding a secondary contact with discussion privileges tied to my investment accounts. Not legal control. Not yet. But a door cracked open. The name listed as inquiry source was Greg Whitmore. I read it twice before the meaning settled in my bones. He had not merely been hovering around my house. He had been circling my money. Martin was careful not to speculate. He simply pointed out that no changes had been made because the bank required direct confirmation. Then he leaned forward and said quietly, Evelyn, if you are considering any major move, do not delay. Sometimes urgency sounds most serious when spoken softly. I left the bank and sat in my car gripping the steering wheel while snow drifted against the windshield. For months, I had wondered whether I was overreading ordinary family concern. That doubt ended in Martin's office. Doubt is what keeps decent people exposed. Clarity can feel cruel, but it protects. I drove straight to Harold. By late afternoon, we added additional security protocols, changed account communication procedures, and documented Greg's inquiry. Harold looked almost grim when he said, You were right to prepare quietly. I asked whether I should confront Lauren. He shook his head. People reveal more when they think you do not know. So I said nothing. Instead, I accelerated everything. Closing on the Tucson casita was moved forward. Movers were booked under the pretense of estate storage. A private courier delivered final trust amendments. I packed after dark. 2 suitcases. 1 carry-on. Walter's photograph wrapped in a cardigan. The quilt folded at the bottom. The old recipe cards tied with ribbon. A life reduced not by loss, but by selection. There was dignity in choosing what mattered. 2 nights before my departure, Lauren called saying she and Greg wanted to take me to dinner Saturday. I knew enough by then to hear agenda beneath invitation. I declined, and said I was tired. She sounded offended. "You keep shutting us out," she said. The irony nearly made me laugh. After we hung up, I walked room to room one last time. In the den, I ran my hand across Walter's leather chair and remembered him reading there with one ankle crossed over the other. In the kitchen, I touched the pantry marks where Lauren grew inch by inch. Love does not disappear because trust fractures. That is what makes betrayal ache. On departure morning, I left before sunrise. No dramatic note.
No confrontation.
Just a brief letter on the table. I need time. Do not look for me until I call. The taxi arrived at 5:15. As we pulled away, the porch light still glowed against the snow. I did not turn back. At Denver International, while waiting to board, my phone lit up with Lauren's name. Then Greg's. Then Lauren again. I let them ring. Somewhere over New Mexico, clouds opened and desert appeared below, copper and gold under morning sun. I felt something inside me loosen for the first time in years. But when I landed in Tucson and turned on my phone, there was one voicemail from Lauren, voice trembling not with grief but panic, saying she had gone to my house and found something in Walter's fire safe she was not supposed to see. The voicemail sat unheard until I reached Maggie's driveway beneath a sky so bright it seemed unreal. Her little casitas smelled faintly of citrus and sun-warmed stucco, and while she showed me where she had left fresh towels and groceries, my mind stayed with Lauren's message. In the fire safe, I had left certain papers too deliberately, not as bait exactly, but as truth waiting for whoever searched where they should not. After Maggie went home, I played the voicemail again. Lauren's voice shook. "Mother, call me. There are documents here I do not understand." Not understand. I almost smiled. She had found the trust schedule Walter drafted years ago, the one structured so any heir proven to exert coercion regarding housing or finances could trigger discretionary charitable reallocation. Walter had always believed the best safeguards were quiet ones. I slept poorly my first night in Arizona, not from fear, but from the strangeness of freedom. Desert silence has a different texture than suburban silence. It does not feel abandoned. It feels wide. At dawn, I stepped into the courtyard barefoot, gravel cool underfoot, a mourning dove calling from the wall. For the first time in months, no one was planning me. That morning I called Harold. He had already heard from Lauren, who apparently arrived at his office demanding explanations. Harold, in his dry way, said she seemed surprised estate structures could respond to behavior. That phrase stayed with me all day. Respond to behavior. Consequences as architecture. I unpacked slowly. Walter's photograph on the bedroom dresser. The quilt folded at the foot of the bed. Recipe cards in the kitchen drawer. Small acts, but they stitched belonging. In the afternoon, Lauren called again. I answered this time. She did not ask how I was. She asked why I had hidden that clause.
Pin.
As though protections were deceptions. I told her Walter had not hidden anything. She had simply never imagined boundaries applied to her. Silence followed, so complete I heard her breathing. Then came the question I had expected. "Are you planning to disinherit me?" I looked at sunlight moving across my courtyard wall and answered, "I am planning to protect myself." She began to cry, but the tears carried anger more than grief. She said Greg had only tried to help. She said I had humiliated them by vanishing. Humiliated. There was that word again, as though my leaving was aggression rather than refusal. I told her we would speak when tempers cooled. Then I ended the call. That evening Maggie brought over enchiladas and stories about widows who moved west and reinvented themselves through gardening clubs and volunteer boards. Ordinary stories. Healing stories. I had forgotten how much kindness can exist without agenda. Yet beneath the calm, another current moved. Harold emailed copies of correspondence showing Greg's brokerage compliance office had opened a preliminary review concerning his inquiries involving a family client. Review. Another quiet word with weight. I read the message twice. Something had shifted beyond family argument. Structures larger than emotion were now in motion. At sunset, I sat alone watching mountains darken purple and thought perhaps escape was only the first half of freedom. The second half was refusing to return emotionally to the cage you left. Just as I began to believe distance might settle things, Maggie handed me the local paper over coffee 3 mornings later and pointed to a business section notice. Greg Whitmore's firm had announced his temporary leave pending internal review. I stared at the print while heat rose through my chest, not triumph exactly, but recognition. The unraveling had begun. And before that week ended, Lauren would board a flight to Arizona carrying an offer she believed could still make me come back. Lauren arrived on a Thursday afternoon in a cream linen suit too formal for desert heat, carrying a leather tote and an expression rehearsed on the flight. She stood outside my courtyard gate, as though unsure whether to knock or apologize first. I let her in and made iced tea. Neither of us mentioned how surreal it was that she had once tried to move me into supervised living and now had crossed 2 states to ask me to come home. For several minutes, she spoke in the language of repair. Misunderstandings. Family strain. Greg under pressure. Then she slid an envelope across the iron patio table. "Before things get worse," she said, "I want to fix this." Inside was an offer drafted by some attorney she had hired in haste. If I returned to Denver and agreed to withdraw complaints tied to financial coercion concerns, she and Greg would renounce any claim to future involvement in my housing decisions. In exchange, certain trust amendments would be revisited. I read it once and set it down. It was remarkable, really. Even repentance arrived as negotiation. I asked whether she had flown 800 miles to apologize or bargain. Her cheeks flushed. She said I was being harsh. I looked beyond her at the Catalina Mountains and remembered how many years I had softened truth to preserve comfort. I was done with that. "Lauren," I said quietly, "you did not lose me when I moved. You began losing me when you tried to manage me." She looked suddenly younger, almost frightened. Then came what I had not expected. She admitted Greg's compliance review had widened. Questions were being asked about his communications, about whether he crossed ethical boundaries discussing a family client. A board position she held had urged her to step back until matters clarified. Reputation, once invisible to me in her priorities, had become immediate pain. There was no triumph in hearing it, only confirmation. The system she trusted more than conscience had finally looked back at her. She asked whether I would help make it stop. For a long moment I studied my daughter's face, seeing not villain or victim, but someone whose hunger for control had outrun wisdom. "Consequences are already moving," I said. "I did not create them. I refused them." She began to cry then, genuinely this time, not for inheritance or embarrassment, but because she sensed the old leverage was gone. We sat in silence broken only by fountain water and distant quail. At last I told her she could stay for dinner if she wished, but I would not sign anything. She stayed. We ate roasted chicken and corn salad while talking, strangely, about ordinary things. Her son's college plans. The drought. A recipe she remembered from childhood. For one brief hour we resembled mother and daughter unshadowed by struggle. Yet before leaving she made one last attempt. "If you do not come back," she said at the gate, "people will think I drove you away." I almost laughed at the honesty of it. Even now, optics. I touched her hand and answered, "Then live in a way that makes that impossible." After she left, I found the envelope still on the patio table where I had forgotten it. I fed it into the shredder the next morning. Later Harold called with new developments. Greg's leave had become suspension pending disciplinary findings. More surprising, he said Lauren had quietly contacted him asking how charitable reallocation clauses could be reversed. Even after Arizona, after tears, after dinner, she was still testing exits. I set down the phone and felt something harden into final understanding. Reconciliation without transformation is only intermission. That evening, while watering the lemon tree, I noticed a certified letter tucked inside my mailbox from Greg's firm, counsel requesting an interview and documentation. I had thought the unraveling had begun with Lauren's flight west. I was wrong. It was only reaching its center. The certified letter remained unopened on my kitchen counter until morning light reached it. I made coffee first. Some truths deserve steady hands. The letter came from counsel representing Greg's firm and requested my cooperation in an ethics inquiry concerning communications, title research activity, and attempted discussions around client-linked assets involving family members. The language was clinical, almost antiseptic, but beneath every phrase I heard a larger sentence. They were documenting a pattern. I called Harold before noon. He told me to answer fully and simply, facts without embellishment. Truth does not need decoration, he said. I liked that.
The
Interview happened by telephone 2 days later. A woman with a measured voice asked about brochures, deposit pressure, title inquiries, Greg's suggestions regarding adding Lauren to my deed, and whether I ever felt urged toward decisions not of my choosing. I answered each question plainly. At the end, she thanked me and said something I did not expect. Mrs. Parker, many people dismiss early coercion signs as family conflict. Your records were unusually complete. Records. All those little notes I wrote after uneasy conversations, every date, every phrase. I had once feared it was paranoia. It had become evidence. After the call, I walked outside trembling slightly, not from fear, but release. For months, I had carried private knowledge like weight. Now it had entered daylight. A week later, Harold called with news. Greg's suspension had become a recommendation for license review. Not criminal, not dramatic, but professional consequences with long shadows. He also told me Lauren had resigned from a foundation board before formal pressure forced it. Trying to get ahead of the story, he said dryly. I sat very still after we hung up. There is a moment when betrayal stops being personal wound and becomes historical fact. I think that was it. Yet life in Arizona kept insisting on tenderness, too. Maggie dragged me to a volunteer literacy luncheon. I joined a book club where women discussed novels and blood pressure with equal seriousness. I planted rosemary by the courtyard wall. My days acquired shape not built around anticipating intrusion. One afternoon, Lauren called unexpectedly. Her voice sounded smaller. She said she had sold their oversized house and moved into a rental while legal expenses mounted. There was no accusation left in her tone, only fatigue. Then she asked whether I had ever intended to punish her. I thought about that long before answering. No, I said. I intended to survive you. She cried softly. I almost reached through the silence. But some wounds heal only when untouched. Before hanging up, she mentioned something odd. Greg believed there were trust schedules he still had not seen, something Walter may have structured beyond charitable reallocations. I said nothing, though my pulse stirred. Because there was one document Harold and I had never discussed with Lauren, a sealed contingent instruction Walter wrote, giving me discretion to liquidate the Denver house and redirect major proceeds entirely outside bloodline inheritance if coercion concerns were substantiated. A sleeping instrument. I had not decided whether to use it. That night, I opened Walter's fire-safe copy and reread the clause by lamplight. My hand rested on the page a long while. This was no longer about protection alone. It was about legacy. The next morning, I drove to Harold's Arizona colleague and signed preliminary papers placing the Denver property into listing preparation. Snow-fed memories, rose hedges, pantry marks, all of it moving toward sale. I wept in the parking lot after, not from regret, but from the cost of finality. As I pulled into my casita, Maggie waved me over with a newspaper in hand. Front page business section. Greg Whitmore formally surrendered his brokerage license pending negotiated resolution. I thought that was the payoff fate had prepared. Then I saw the second headline beneath it naming a charitable scholarship initiative launching in Walter Parker's honor funded by an anonymous donor. Anonymous, except Lauren would know exactly where that money came from. The scholarship announcement reached Lauren before I called her. I knew because her message arrived before sunrise, voice raw, asking whether I had really redirected part of the Denver property proceeds into Walter Parker Scholars, a fund for first-generation nursing students at a community college in Colorado. I listened twice before answering. There was no anger in her tone now, only disbelief, as if the final shape of my choices had exceeded even her imagination. I called back after coffee. She did not begin with accusation this time. She asked why strangers deserved what family had expected. I looked through my courtyard at the lemon tree bending in warm wind and answered with a calm that surprised even me. Because legacy is not reward for blood. It is responsibility shaped by character. Silence met me, heavy and wounded. Then she said, something I had waited months to hear. I thought if you moved somewhere supervised, we could keep things orderly. Not safe. Orderly. There it was at last, naked and unadorned. The instinct had never been protection. It had been control disguised as efficiency. I did not scold her. Truth had already done harder work than scolding ever could. The Denver house sold within weeks. A young family bought it, children included, and I imagined new pencil marks one day beside Lauren's old ones. The closing funds moved exactly as Walter's contingent instructions allowed. Charitable annuities funded. My Arizona trust fully capitalized. Medical proxies permanently reassigned. The final amendments executed in a law office where Harold, appearing by video from Denver, smiled in that thin way lawyers smile when justice arrives through paperwork. You have done something rare, he told me. You turned pressure into structure. I thought about that phrase for days. Meanwhile, consequences gathered around Greg with almost mathematical precision. His negotiated resolution became public record. He surrendered his license, paid significant penalties tied to compliance failures, and lost consulting contracts that once underwrote the life Lauren had defended so fiercely. No dramatic courtroom, no handcuffs, only the colder punishment of professional diminishment. In some ways it felt more fitting. Reputation had been their altar. Reputation became the cost. Lauren called less often after that, though when she did, she sounded gentler. Once she admitted the women on her former foundation board had quietly distanced themselves after details circulated. I did not realize people were watching, she said. I nearly answered that children always think family walls are soundproof. Instead I said, character is loud even when whispered. Months passed. Desert winter softened into spring. I joined the literacy board Maggie first dragged me toward. I taught beginner readers every Tuesday. My world no longer revolved around defense. It revolved around use. Then one afternoon Lauren appeared again, unannounced but different. No legal envelopes.
No bargaining.
She brought only a cardboard box. Inside were things she found while clearing storage after selling their house. Walter's old fountain pen. My mother's cameo brooch. A photograph of Lauren at 12 on the porch where Walter had explained why precious things need structure. We sat in silence over those relics until she finally said, "You chose Arizona over me." I looked at her for a long moment and answered, "No. I chose myself when you stopped leaving me room to be me." She wept openly then, and for the first time, I believed she understood loss beyond inheritance. Before she left, I handed her a copy of the scholarship dedication program bearing Walter's name. "If you want to honor what was broken," I said, "help fund the next class." She nodded. Not redeemed, perhaps, but humbled. That night I stood on the patio under stars sharp as glass and realized the story no longer belonged to betrayal. It belonged to authorship. They had tried to move me out of my own life. Instead, I moved west, protected what mattered, exposed what hid behind concern, and turned the house they once counted on into something that would outlive all of us. I thought that was the end. Then Harold called with one final surprise. A state ethics panel had issued a formal written finding citing attempted undue influence patterns in Greg's conduct, language that would remain part of his record permanently. Not rumor, not family grievance. Official record. And in that moment, I knew the last loose thread had finally been pulled tight. Harold mailed me a copy of the ethics panel finding on cream legal paper thick enough to feel ceremonial. I read the phrase 3 times. Pattern of undue influence. Those 4 words carried more force than anger ever could. They did not shout. They settled. Greg's conduct was no longer a matter of competing family stories, but part of permanent professional record. For a long time I sat with the document on my patio table while desert light shifted across the page. I expected triumph. Instead I felt something quieter. Completion. There is a difference.
Triumph feeds ego.
Completion restores order. When Lauren called that evening, her voice held none of its old defensiveness. She had read the finding.
2. It is over, she said.
I looked toward the mountains and answered. It was over the day I stopped letting fear make my decisions. A week later, she asked if she could visit again, this time alone. I said yes. She arrived in simple clothes, no performance left in her posture, carrying a small tin recipe box I thought had been lost in the move. Inside were my handwritten holiday recipes and one folded note in Walter's hand I had never seen. It read only, "Teach her boundaries while there is still time." I laughed softly when I read it. Even from memory, Walter refused poor timing. Lauren cried when she saw me smile. We sat beneath the courtyard shade and for the first time spoke plainly. She admitted she had mistaken competence for entitlement, that after Walter died, she panicked at the thought of assets unmanaged and convinced herself intervention was love. I made control sound like care, she said. There was no defense left in that sentence. Only confession. I asked whether she understood what hurt most. She nodded before I answered. It was not the brochures. It was that you spoke as if my life had become administrative. She covered her face and wept. I let silence do its old healing work. Then I handed her copies of the final trust instruments, not as invitation to contest, but as proof there would be no ambiguity ever again. My Arizona home protected. My medical decisions assigned elsewhere. The scholarship funded for years. The charitable annuities locked. The chapter closed in law as well as feeling. She studied the papers and said, almost in wonder, "You thought of everything." I shook my head.
No.
I finally thought of myself. We shared dinner that night, and when she rose to leave, she paused at the gate. "Will you ever trust me again?" she asked. I considered lying kindly. Instead, I gave her the truer gift. Trust returns through pattern, not apology. She nodded, and for once accepted an answer without negotiation. Months passed. She began contributing quietly to Walter Parker Scholars, at first a modest donation, then mentoring one nursing student each semester. I did not call it redemption. Redemption is too dramatic a word for the slow work of
decency.
I called it practice. Greg faded from our conversations. Last I heard, he was doing contract consulting far from the prestige he once wore like skin. His name occasionally surfaced attached to the ethics finding, a permanent footnote to ambition. That felt fitting. Some consequences should not disappear. On my 73rd birthday, the Literacy Board honored me with a small plaque for volunteer service. Maggie joked I had become a Tucson institution. I laughed harder than the joke deserved, because she did not know how impossible that sentence would have sounded a year earlier when others planned to place me somewhere supervised. Later that evening, Lauren called and said she had one more thing to tell me. She had withdrawn herself formally from any expectation tied to my estate and filed the disclaimer with counsel. "I want you to know I am not waiting for anything anymore," she said. That, more than tears or apologies, was the deepest amends she could have made. After the call, I placed the ethics finding, Walter's note, and Lauren's disclaimer together in the fire safe. Not as trophies. As evidence of a life defended. I thought of the woman who once sat frozen at a kitchen table while her daughter suggested assisted living as though decline were logistics. That woman had vanished somewhere over New Mexico. In her place stood someone who had exposed the lie beneath concern, redirected wealth toward purpose, survived betrayal without becoming bitter, and forced everyone involved to live under the truth. Only one thing remained now. To choose, finally and publicly, who would carry my name forward when I was gone. On the morning I signed the final successor documents, the desert air carried orange blossom through the courtyard, and everything felt strangely ordinary for a day that would close an entire era. My attorney in Arizona sat beside me at a polished walnut table while Harold joined by video from Denver, and together we executed the last instrument Walter's old trust had contemplated, but never expected would be needed. I named the Walter Parker Scholars Foundation as primary legacy beneficiary beyond specific personal gifts, expanded its endowment with the final tranche from the Denver sale, and appointed an independent charitable board rather than family control. My name, Once treated as something to be managed, now anchored an institution that would outlive every argument that had nearly broken me. When the last signature dried, Harold leaned back and said, "Mrs. Parker, no one can challenge this structure without failing." That sentence carried a music I will never forget. Yet the deeper reckoning came 2 weeks later when the state ethics panel issued its public disciplinary summary. It named Greg's conduct in plain language, citing improper familial pressure tied to financial positioning and failures of professional judgment. Trade publications picked it up. The country club whispers Lauren once feared became formal social distance. A charitable gala where she had once chaired fundraising quietly rescinded her honorary role. Invitations stopped. Consulting offers dried up. Greg paid penalties large enough to force liquidation of investments they once guarded so fiercely. Their losses were not theatrical, but they were undeniable. Money, status, reputation, all diminished by the very appetite that caused them. And what struck me most was that none of it came from revenge. It came from exposure. Truth had simply been allowed to finish its work. Lauren flew in once more after the disciplinary summary, but this visit was different from all before. She came not to negotiate, not to plead, but to witness. I took her with me to the scholarship luncheon where 12 nursing students in white uniforms stood and thanked donors they had never met. One young woman from rural New Mexico spoke about caring for her diabetic grandmother and wanting to become a geriatric nurse. As she spoke, Lauren quietly wept beside me. Afterward, she whispered, "This was supposed to be my inheritance." I turned to her and said, "No, this is your inheritance. You just thought inheritance meant possession." Something in her face softened in a way I had not seen since she was a child. Later that afternoon, we sat on my patio, and I handed her a sealed envelope. She looked startled. Inside was a letter appointing her not as heir to control, but as one of several rotating volunteer mentors attached to the scholarship program, contingent on service, not blood. "If you want my name," I told her, "carry it through conduct." She broke down entirely then, not with the tears of panic I had heard months ago, but with the grief of someone finally seeing who she had been. She asked if I forgave her. I said forgiveness had arrived long before trust, but trust is built where entitlement ends. She nodded.
No argument.
No defense. At sunset, she left carrying no promises of property, no illusions of power, only a binder of scholarship materials and a humility I once believed beyond her reach. That was the last time we spoke of assisted living, inheritance, or Greg. Those ghosts had no oxygen left. Months later, I received notice that Greg's disciplinary findings would remain permanently accessible through professional records.
Permanent.
I stared at that word for a long while, because permanence had once frightened me. Now it comforted me. The record would outlast revision. No one would ever reduce what happened to family misunderstanding. It had been named. It had consequences. It was finished. On my 74th birthday, the Literacy Board and Scholarship Foundation held a small joint dinner in Tucson. Maggie raised a glass and called me the woman who moved west and rewrote the ending. Everyone laughed. I did too. But privately, I knew the deeper truth. I had not merely escaped being put away. I had exposed a daughter's quiet betrayal, survived a son-in-law's greed, protected my assets through law, redirected wealth into legacy, and watched those who tried to control me lose the very prestige they worshipped. They had urged me toward supervised decline. Instead, I built a foundation in my husband's name, preserved my independence, and made their attempted manipulation the reason strangers would rise for generations. That is not revenge. That is victory. And when I lock my fire safe now, inside it sit 3 things only: Walter's note about boundaries, the ethics finding that stripped pretense from ambition, and the scholarship charter bearing my signature. Those are the only monuments I need. Because in the end, my daughter did not place me in assisted living. I placed her assumptions in history. I kept my freedom. I kept my name. I kept control. And when people in town ask how I came to Arizona alone at 72, I smile and tell them the simplest truth of all. Sometimes the moment your family tries to move you out of your life is the moment you finally move fully into it.